Welcome, Nord Anglia, to today's MIT abstract on past climates and future scientists with MIT PhD graduate, Dr. Gabriela Serrato Marks. I'm your host, Fatima Hussein, and I'm a graduate student at MIT studying ancient life on Earth. So before we begin, I'd like to cue you all in to what an abstract actually is. An abstract is just a snapshot or a summary of a greater work of research or writing, and with this super fun series, we're bringing you abstracts of inspiring MIT experts anywhere you are around the world. So now I'm going to introduce you today to our amazing expert. She's a really important personal role model of mine, and she's currently a program coordinator at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Welcome, Dr. Gabriela Serrato Marks. Hey, Gabi.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be here with all of you.
Excellent. Well, Gabi, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to let you take it away and to tell us all about ancient climates and future scientists.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Fatima for the introduction. It's great to be here with a friend of mine from grad school. I'm Gabi, like Fatima said, and I finished my PhD at MIT in 2020, so just about a year ago. And I'm a geologist. So that's a real picture of me in a cave with all of my climbing gear on. And you can see that I have a helmet, a headlamp, and that is what a day in my life used to look like. So I have a lot of other identities that are important to me. I have two cats who you might see pop up while we're doing this talk. Their names are Spock and Moose, but I'm really excited to talk to you all today about my research in geology and also about what I'm doing now, which is a little bit different. So for my PhD, I studied caves in Mexico, and I studied them right here in the central part of Mexico. Just to orient you, this is the Baja Peninsula here, this is Louisiana in the US, and then this is the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. So there's no borders here because in geology, we just look at the rocks. So here you have all the different mountains that you might see throughout Mexico. Here's Mexico City, in case you're familiar with that huge city that's there. And the really cool thing for me is that my family actually lives just a couple hours away from my research site. And so this is a really old picture now, but most of these people still live here in Moroleón, Guanajuato in Mexico. So I love to be able to go to Mexico because I identify as Mexican American. My grandparents moved to the US from Mexico. And so I feel really, really lucky to get to go back to do my research there in a place that's really special to me. This is a region that's already super dry. So you can see these mud cracks here. It looks like a desert, cacti. And this means that there's not a lot of rain that comes to this area. It's a place where it's just so dry. There's still things that grow because they're desert plants, but as climate change progresses, it's actually going to get even more dry, which is going to be a problem for everyone who lives there because it's going to be harder to find drinking water. It's going to be harder to water crops. And so this is the reason why we really need to study this area to try to figure out exactly how dry is it going to get in the future? And also how can we try to mitigate that? How we try to fix that so that it doesn't have an impact on people's lives. So right now we know it's already hot. There are cacti. We know what it looks like now. In the future, we can use computer models of weather to try to understand what it will look like going forward. I think you've had a couple other abstracts about that. So hopefully you can get to see that later or that you've already seen it. The problem that I'm trying to solve is this part, the past. We already know the present and we have some sense of the future, but how do we know what it looked like before? So, oops. I look at these past climate. We need a logbook to tell us what the climate looked like in the past, but we don't have them, at least in most places. We need records that go back thousands of years. And in some places we only have 100 or 500. Some places we have like 1,000 years of data, which is great, but usually it's only a couple hundred years or even like 50 years of data. So we need logbooks that go back thousands and thousands of years, back to the Ice Age, back to when there were totally different climate and weather in this area. So that's what I do. I try to find these logbooks. But like I said, I'm a geologist. I'm not a historian. So I use rocks as my logbooks. This is a picture of me in a cave, and you can see here, these are stalactites. Those are the type of rocks that grow from the top of the cave. And then down here, you can see some stalagmites. You can see my headlamp here is lighting a couple of them up, and I'm taking a water sample using gloves and some Ziploc bags like you might have at home, just a reusable bag that we can collect water in. So I use the same stuff that you might use at home in the cave. And then these stalagmites here are the kind that grow on the ground. This is what one looks like when it's split open. So you can see it has layers. It grows from the bottom down here. Every year it grows a little bit taller, a little bit bigger, and it goes upward like this. So this top here is the end of the growth of the stalagmite. This is one that we sawed open using a pretty big power saw in my lab at MIT. And so this is how it looks after we polish it. Each of these layers forms a page in my logbook that I study. So again, I'm not actually looking at books, I'm looking at these stalagmites, and we treat them like books that we can understand the past. So each layer forms one page in my book, and I try to figure out how old these pages are and what they can tell us about climate. Like I said, there are stalactites. These ones, we call them soda straws because they're super skinny and sometimes they're even hollow. You can't actually drink soda with them. We try not to touch them at all because cave formations are really delicate and really take a really long time to grow. So these might have been growing for hundreds or thousands of years. So we try our best not to disturb them because they're just doing their best to grow down in the cave. But they are called soda straws. I think those are really fun. My personal favorite type of cave formation, other than stalagmites, which I use for my research, is what we call cave bacon. So you can see here, it's not really bacon, it's made of rock, but it has these layers and sort of ripples and some kind of white and lighter or darker areas that look a little bit like bacon. So when you're in a cave, you've been doing field work for the whole day, it starts to look like bacon. You might be a little hungry. We eat a granola bar instead from our backpack, but we like to look at it and see the beauty of the cave and how sort of glittery it is. It's really one of the only places on Earth that I've ever seen rock this bright and glittery. So I really enjoy being in the cave to see these. I feel really, really lucky that I've gotten to see this. Maybe some of you live near caves, and if you do, remember to be really careful around these special formations because the oils from our hands can actually make it harder for them to grow. So I try to make sure that we never touch them without gloves on, even don't touch them at all if we don't have to. But if you do live near a cave and you can explore it safely with adults and in a tour or something like that, then make sure you look for soda straws or cave bacon like this. These stalagmites are really hard to get to. We go in a whole team like this. This is a field team that I worked with before the pandemic happened. And we're up in the mountains. We had to hike 45 minutes all the way up here, and then we had to keep going more. We use these ropes that Miguel is holding here around his neck to go down into the cave. Unfortunately, during this trip, we also busted 2 tires on this pickup truck. So we had to replace the tires, and that added some time to our day, but it was still a really, really fun adventure to try to get up there. Once we even get to the cave, we have to climb down these ladders, and we climb hundreds of rungs of ladders, and they're basically straight up and down. We wear our helmets, but we actually don't wear or use harnesses for these because they're not designed for cavers. They're designed for miners or welders who have to go down there to monitor this water pipe that you can see here in brown, and they don't have climbing equipment. So there's no place for us to really hook on. And we go down with all our other safety precautions and make sure that we are going slowly, But sometimes for me, it takes me even longer, or it's even more challenging because I actually have a physical disability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that with all of you. I think it's really important to know that you can be a scientist and have a disability. There's lots of different kinds of disabilities. You might know people who have learning disabilities. You might have a learning disability. You might know people who have hands or limbs that are different from everyone else's. And that's great. You could still be a scientist even with a disability. I'm really proud of the fact that I have a disability. It's part of my identity. Even though if you look at me, you can't necessarily tell that I have a disability. So I use this wheelchair symbol because it's a mostly international symbol for disabilities, but I don't use a wheelchair. And so if you just look at me, you might not know that I have this experience. And then we have this emoji with the head bandage. And I thought it was so funny that it looks so sad because even when my head hurts, I'm still doing lots of things that I really enjoy. So this is, again, me in a cave doing a titration, which maybe you've done in science class or you might do in the future, where you add small amounts of one solution to another to change the color. I'm actually doing that very simple thing right here in the cave as part of my research. And here you can see I'm wearing a helmet. My head really hurt underneath there, but I was still having a great time. I was still able to do everything that I needed to do. So we weren't sad. I think it's really important to know that even with a disability, you can be a successful scientist and it can be smooth and you can work together with your field mates or your colleagues to make sure that everybody has access to the science. So I realized as part of my journey in grad school, it was really important to me to try to make sure that everyone knows that they can be a scientist if they want to be. And so now I've transitioned away from doing research and I actually help people become scientists. So I think I missed one picture here. Instead of being in the cave here, I work at the Broad Institute, which is just across the street from where I used to work with Fatima. I didn't go very far, but I work here, which is a biomedical research institute. Right now, they're doing a lot of COVID testing. They're doing a lot of research on COVID, but they study all kinds of different diseases and health conditions and try to make life better and healthier for everyone. So I work here now and I run a program called a Postbac, and that's between college and grad school. Most of the students I work with are going to get PhDs, and it's called a Postbac, which stands for short for a Postbaccalaureate program. So I help people who are already done with college, they're ready to go to grad school, but they want to get a little bit more research experience. They want to learn more about exactly what they love to do. So they've already done kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. Then they've done 13th grade all the way to 13, 14, 15, 16th grade of college. And then they do a 2-year postbac with my group at the Broad Institute. And then they do a PhD. So it's a lot of school. And I think the cool thing is we really enjoy this process. It's a really fun time. And as part of my job, I get time at night to make sure that I can do all kinds of other things, whether that's taking care of my cats or cooking dinner. And the other thing that I do is I'm actually editing a book, and it's full of stories by disabled scientists. And they're not stories like a bedtime story that's made up. It's a real story about their life. And they're writing it down so that people all around the world, including some of you, if you're interested, can read about disabled scientists and what we do. So just like you saw me in the cave, I have friends who are deaf, who are out in the field working with birds. I have friends who use wheelchairs, who are doing research studies on green green landscaping in cities, all kinds of friends around the world who are disabled and are working as scientists. So I'm writing a book about all of them, or I'm editing a book with their stories. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of these topics that I've talked about. I've hit a couple different things here, but I really am grateful for you for listening to what I've done so far, and I hope that we can have some good Q&A now. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabi. We have so many amazing questions.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop my share there.
Awesome. And the first one, and I wanted to give some context for folks who aren't, geoscientists like you and me. So why do we care about the past? Why do we need to study it in the first place?
That's a great question. One reason is just to know it. I think it's a very natural human curiosity to know about these things that happened in the past before we were here on the planet, meaning us. There were lots of other people on the planet, but we were not here. So I think it's great to be curious and to just know something or want to know something just for fun. But the other reason that's really important scientifically is so that we can put that data from the past into those future climate models and make sure that those future models are really accurate because we're using them to plan for future climate change. So we do things like test them. It sort of works as like an answer key. So we ask the climate model, okay, try to make a model of what the past should have looked like in this area. And then if they get something that's really different from the answer key, we know that we need to fix the model. So I'm generating that data. We call it benchmarks or calibration. There's all kinds of different words for it, but I'm generating the data that you can then feed into those climate models for the future.
Got it. So basically the past is important not only for, of course, unlocking the past and giving us info about what happened, but also to help us understand the future a little bit better and predict things like effects of climate change, for example, right?
Exactly, yes, and extreme weather and all kinds of different aspects of climate and weather that are important to people who live there.
Excellent. Okay, and now we have, I think, Gabi, I think you have inspired some future climate scientists and geologists. So we have
Ooh,
a
exciting.
question
Okay.
from Giotsana, and she's wondering, how can you figure out climate with the rocks? Like, what are you looking at in these stalagmites specifically that's like, this tells me about climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I sort of smoothed right over to show you lots of pictures of caves. So I'm glad that you asked exactly how we're doing this. So I open up those stalagmites. Like I said, I saw them open and I take samples from each of those little layers, those what I called logbook pages, and I look at the chemical concentrations of oxygen, carbon, and uranium and thorium, so 4 different elements. And I look at how those ratios change, so how much of one there is versus how much of another. And that actually tells us how much rain there was in the past. And it's not as good as a rain gauge that can say we had 50 millimeters of rain, but it gives us a relative sense of was it wet or was it dry, and how old was this rock. So during my PhD, I did a lot of work on trying to figure out how old the rocks were. So what's the date on top of that logbook page, because we don't get that built into the stalagmites. And then I have colleagues who work on the chemical concentrations that tell us about climate itself.
Got it. And now Anisha Soni is asking, when you're going into these caves, do you encounter any dangerous rocks that you have to, get around, or, how do you navigate that? It seems pretty spiky.
Yeah, that's a great question also. These are all awesome. Thank you all so much. There are definitely a couple spiky rocks. I have a scar on my hand that you can see here from when I was really brand new to caving. So this is why I said you should only go exploring in a cave if you know somebody who's really experienced, because I actually cut my hand open in the Yucatan Peninsula and it still hasn't healed. Well, it has healed, but it's only a scar now. But that's only one of the few scars I have from the spiky rock. So we try our best to be really, really careful. I keep a first aid kit with me all the time. Usually we don't need it, but just in case, we try to be as careful as we can. That's why we wear helmets, because sometimes when you're can't quite see as well as you can in the daylight, it's really easy to actually bump your head. So I've bumped my head very lightly a few times. So I'm grateful to have the helmet on there. And also just to make sure that we're wearing usually long sleeves until we get to the research portion, or long pants, so that we're covered up as much as possible, especially from the mosquitoes. Honestly, the mosquitoes are a bigger challenge than the spiky rocks for me.
Oh man. Well, we can all agree on how annoying mosquitoes can be. Um,
Yeah.
So Greta asks a pretty good question that I think we all wonder from time to time. She wants to know, how do you, remember where stalactites grew from versus stalagmites? So can you remind us what the difference is? And then how do you remember like which one is which?
That's a great question too. These are so fun. Thank you so much. The stalactites are the ones that grow on the ceiling. Stalagmites are the ones that grow on the ground. And so from working in caves, it's just sort of stuck in my head the same way that you start to remember your times tables, or I don't know what else you might memorize, but all kinds of things. It just sort of sticks for me, but I've heard lots of different memory devices over the years. So one is to watch out or you might trip on a stalagmite. And then a stalactite is holding onto the ceiling tight. I've heard a couple different ones, but the tight ones are the ones that are on the ceiling and the mite ones are on the ground. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so there you go. That's a good way to do it. I think I'll have to steal that one because I always get them mixed up too. And
Yeah.
now we have a related question from Anya, and she's wondering, she saw that picture of cave bacon, which was pretty interesting, and she wants to know, like, if stalagmites grow from the ground, where does cave bacon grow from?
Great question. So cave bacon is more closely related to a stalactite, I would say, than to a stalagmite, but it's what we call a speleothem. So stalactites, stalagmites, cave bacon, soda straws, those are all examples of speleothems, which just mean a rock that grew in a cave. And so cave bacon was one of the ones that we'd call it formally like a wall formation. It's one where water drips from the side of a wall and slowly adds, both going up and down and side to side. And so it's a really cool formation for that reason, because it's growing in all directions. So I would say that it's closer to a stalactite because it does come from the ceiling and it's sort of dripping down. But it's a wall formation if I had to be formal about it.
Got it. Okay, so it's sticking to the side of a wall or surface. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Got
Yes.
it. Okay, so you can find
And
the cave.
growing off of that surface.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's growing off of that surface. And speaking of things that are again growing in these caves, again, I think we have a future spelunkers here, people who are going to
Yep.
explore these caves and go down into them. Anisha is also wondering, can a stalactite fall down from the top of a cave? And how do you know if you find one on the floor, how do you know that it's not a knocked over stalagmite, for example?
Oh, yeah, that's a really tricky one. Stalactites and stalagmites can both fall as they grow. There's a lot of different reasons why. Sometimes it's because humans damage them. Sometimes it's earthquakes that create cracks in them, or just natural changes in the rocks over time. So I've had trouble before trying to tell the difference between a fallen stalactite and a fallen stalagmite, because they can start to look pretty similar. In general, stalagmites are usually bigger just because they can be supported on the ground, and the ones on the ceiling just sort of stretch out long, but they're not going to get as wide. So that's one way we can tell if it's really narrow or if it's wider. The stalagmites that I work with are like about the size of my hand if I hold them facing someone, and then they can be really tall. They can be up to 1 meter tall, or even bigger in some caves. But the stalactites in the caves that I go to are usually only like this big. They're pretty small. Sometimes the bigger ones will be like this big, and then the
Oh,
cave bacon wall formations will stretch out longer, but those don't fall down as often. So from the size, we can tell the layering is a little bit different. And then the stalactites also end up being more hollow or fully hollow than the stalagmites, which are really solid. They're much heavier. So those are a couple ways that we tell, but both can fall, and it can be tricky to figure out what exactly it is, where it came from, and how we can use it.
got it. And now I'm wondering, we have so many students who are asking a variation of what is your overall inspiration and what inspired you to go into geology in the first place and do science and study ancient climate? What got Gabi here?
Yeah, I have always loved kind of science and all types of science. And I really wanted to find a way that I could bring multiple types of science together. So I like geology a lot because it uses physics, it uses math, chemistry. I did a lot of chemistry in my PhD, and it uses some biology. I try to avoid the biology really and try not to be touching bat guano or anything else that's alive in the cave. I try to, guano's not alive, but from the bats. Anything in the cave that is biological, I usually avoid, but it is part of the cave system and how it all works. So that's something I really have always loved about earth science, is that it combines all of these into one discipline. And I started out in college by being an earth and oceanographic science major. I went to a small school in Maine in the US. And then after that, I wanted to keep learning about earth science. And so that's how I ended up going to MIT for my PhD. Hopefully that answers how I got to where I am. And the why, I think, is, yeah, just a combination of all kinds of different factors of science, and also that I think climate science is extremely important. And I personally am motivated by an understanding that my family in Mexico often doesn't have access to potable water. They have to get water from the store in a big jug. And here in Boston, I don't have to do that. I can just turn on the tap and drink the water out of it. And I recognize that that's a privilege that I have. That's something I feel really lucky to be able to do. And so studying water in Mexico, all around the world, I know it's a precious resource, and I want to make sure that everyone has access to it. So that's something that also motivates me.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And now we have a question that I think kind of is a natural transition. So you just kind of described to us how you got into how you got into geology and earth science and why you do it. Now we have a really good question from Tram on, and Tram's wondering, what does a day in the life of geologist like really look like? How often are you actually in caves versus studying samples in the lab and looking at data? And which process, like which parts of being a geologist do you like the most? What are your favorite parts?
I really like exactly what the student identified, that there are so many different parts that we have to do. So I like that one day is not going to look the same as a day 6 months later for me. So I spend usually between 1 and 3 weeks on field trips every year. And that was before COVID. So now it's been a long time since we've gone back to the caves to check on our monitoring equipment. I'm sure all the batteries are dead and they're probably pretty full of water, but we'll go back to check on them as soon as we can. But we usually go about between 1 and 3 times a year to Mexico for this project that I'm talking about. And the rest of the time I'm working in lab. I'm using my laptop to figure out my data. So taking notes on my data, analyzing images of my stalagmites or of the stalagmites that I use. What else? Talking to Fatima in the hallways of our building and other friends who I see around, because that's also another really important aspect of grad school, is building a network of people who are also scientists and who enjoy some of the same things that you enjoy. And what else? What else do I do in the day? Take breaks. I take lots of breaks during the day, eat lunch, drink coffee. I have my coffee here. Now that I'm at home, I deal with my cats, including the one who's currently shouting. I hope you can't hear him too loudly, but would like to come out of the room where he is. So that's part of it too. I think it's really important to take breaks throughout the day, stretch, get outside. And yeah, it's a combination of a lot of different things, which is something I love.
And now we have Charvik's asking, you're able to do all these amazing things. And of course, I love being able to I loved being able to bump into you in the halls, and just a fun fact behind the scenes, I guess, of MIT Abstracts. When I was working, every time I'd walk out of the lab, I would peek into Gabi's office and window and see if she was around to see if I could bother her from the work she was doing on the computer, and we would get coffee and sit and chat and talk about plants and all these fun things. So that was super awesome. So Trevik's wondering, why MIT of all places to study this?
Yeah, MIT is not exactly known for earth science, I would say. It's not a place a lot of people go and they're like, I'm going to be a geologist at MIT, because people really know MIT for robots, for computer science, for, well, all kinds of things, right? And so I feel lucky that I got to be at MIT, which is a place that does so much different science and research. And the reason that I really wanted to be at MIT is because of a joint program that it has with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So I got one PhD, not two, only one PhD, but it was actually a joint degree from MIT and we call WHOI, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And we love to be able to study the ocean using earth science techniques, the earth using oceanography techniques, really a holistic way of looking at the earth. So I got to take classes on Cape Cod, which is in Massachusetts, but about an hour and a half away from Cambridge. And then I also got to do my research at MIT. So that program was what really got me interested in MIT to begin with. But I also grew up right outside of Boston. So I grew up seeing the big dome that's behind Fatima's background, being in the neighborhood. And so it was a place that was familiar to me and a place I really enjoyed being. So that was definitely part of it also.
And I'm really glad that you came to MIT because that's how I got to
Yeah,
meet
me
you.
too.
And now we have a student who's wondering about the future. And they know that you're studying ancient climate through these things, and we know that studying ancient climate helps us better understand the changes we might experience in the future. So our student's asking, I think, a pretty interesting question. From what you've already seen, Gabi, where is our climate headed?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a big question for sure. I think that there's still a lot that we can do to try to, again, mitigate or I don't know, what's a better word for mitigate, like decrease the effects of
Mhm.
climate change. But from the research that I've done in this area of Mexico, it's not looking very positive. It's looking like there's a lot that's going to need to be done because it is going to get even drier. There are going to be more extreme weather events going forward. And that's true really around the world. Some places are going to get wetter and have more floods. Some places are going to be drier and have even more of a challenge with agriculture, for example. So I would say I'm trying to stay really positive because I think it's super important to have hope and to know that there's a lot that all of you can do to decrease the effects of climate change. But at the same time, this is a really important field to study because it is something that's already affecting people around the world. You might already have noticed a difference from what your family says, how things used to be in your weather and climate. So the short version is we need to do a lot of work to conserve water, for example, to be able to return rain to the earth down below into these caves and other underground storage containers, natural storage containers for water, for example. So there's a lot we can do, but a lot that needs to be done also.
Of course. So it would be fair to say that the students listening to this call, whether or not they want to pursue science specifically and do the kind of work you do, they can still get involved in working on climate issues, and they could use, the humanities or think about history or policy or politics. There's so many options, right? Everyone can get involved.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yes. And I think we need everyone to be involved to try to work on climate change and sustainability. And I love the idea of using all different disciplines to approach a more positive environment for all of us.
Awesome. Well, you heard it from Gabi. You got to get on it, guys. We
Yeah.
have a really interesting question, and it's made me quite curious too. One of our Nord Anglia students is asking, why do stalactites grow in the first place?
Mm, yeah, super interesting. I think the stalactites are fascinating, even though I don't study them specifically. So the stalactites are actually like the source for my stalagmites also. So as water drips through the cave, it starts to pick up different chemicals, different aspects of the ground rock that's around it. So as the water trickles through the ground, it has all kinds of dissolved ions and chemicals that are in that water. And so then as it gets to the cave ceiling and it starts to drip through, the cave is really wet and cold. And so it takes a long time for that drip to actually fall, or it doesn't fall at all. It just dries off on that ceiling. And so then very slowly over time, those water droplets start to crystallize into cave formations like stalactites or stalagmites. The ones on the ceiling, again, are the stalactites. So as water drips and hardens, then the next drop can come and adds to it. So it's sort of like building a drip castle with sand, if you've ever used wet sand to slowly add on top of it, or like even baking a layer cake and putting layers and layers and layers, or some other snack you might make. But it slowly grows when the water drips and then hardens or crystallizes using those dissolved chemicals that are in the water.
Got it. Okay,
Hopefully that
so
makes sense.
that's why it takes a really long time because those processes are super duper slow, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it. So you're not going to see one grow anytime soon before your own eyes, but luckily, like Gabi, you can go down into the caves and find ones that grew well before we were here and study them in the
Exactly.
lab.
Yeah.
Uh,
All the stalagmites that I study are way older than me. So they're definitely way older than all of us.
oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And speaking of ages, you mentioned that when you collect samples from stalagmites and you bring them into the lab, one of the things that you can find out is how old it is. And we have we have a student asking, how do you know? What are you
Mm.
looking for in there?
Yeah, so when I'm using those stalagmites, I have to figure out how old they are, just like you said. And we do that using the uranium and thorium ratio that's in the stalagmite. So how much of one chemical there is, or how much of the other there is. Because over time, they are actually radioactive elements. And so they decay or they change into each other. And so we see that as they get older, those ratios change, and we use lots of different equations in a spreadsheet to figure out how old they are. But we take samples all up and down the stalagmite horizontally. So we get each page from the logbook, and we try to find hopefully ages that are all in order, because we know based on the way that the stalagmite grew that the bottom one has to be the oldest and the top one has to be the youngest. And so sometimes when we get ages that are all over the place, or it seems like it suddenly got younger and then older, we know that that doesn't make sense. And so we're able to adjust our calculations and redo those analyses if we need to make sure that we know accurately how old it is. And in an ideal case, we would have two stalagmites from the same cave that grew next to each other at the same time. And then we can make sure that, for example, 50 years ago, this one said it was wet, and its neighbor said 50 years ago it was also wet. And so using that kind of cross collaboration of the two stalagmites, if you will, that's the ideal case. We don't Wait, that's very rare to get that, because caves are random, because nature is random, right? So they're not always going to grow side by side like that. And we also try to take as few stalagmites as we can. So we only take really one. We're not going to take two that look identical unless we're really trying to do that type of study. So short version, all together, we figure out the age looking at the chemical ratios. We check it by seeing if it grew over time the way we would expect it to. And third, ideally, we try to get multiple samples to check across these stalagmites.
Got it. Okay. And now, we have a couple of questions related to, it seems like, burning curiosity about caves. So first, I'm going to read you Angelina's question. So Angelina wonders,
Okay.
are there any specific materials in the cave that you aren't allowed to touch or collect? And if so, like, what are they?
I would say we definitely don't need to be collecting anything that's alive. So I don't touch any of the alive stuff. I think overall our goal is to just not touch or disturb anything that we don't need for our research, because we want to preserve the caves. There are other researchers sometimes who work in the caves. So if we took a sample of a slime mold that was growing in the cave, then another researcher might not have that same slime mold, even though I was just curious. So I leave it there. Sometimes there are tree roots that grow through the cave. We leave those there because that's a really important source of water for the trees that are above the cave, and also a source of chemical changes for the cave. So we try to preserve it as best as we can. When I'm in a cave where I am learning from others, or I'm not doing my own research, usually we wear gloves and we try to touch as little as possible, and sometimes don't even sample anything at all. I went to a cave in Spain where I almost put my hand on a wall and someone said, "Oh, please don't touch that," because it was a really special place where there had been ancient humans a really long time ago. And so we don't want to be putting our hands where their hands were. It's a really special cave. So I almost made that mistake and someone stopped me just in time. So basically keep your hands to yourself, sort of like a store with lots of fragile things, and just make sure that we don't disturb things as much as possible. When I fell and I scarred my hand, I disturbed some rocks, right? Like I went sliding down and the rocks moved. So sometimes it happens and we don't mean it to, and that's okay. But in general, don't touch anything that I don't need for my research, especially the bat poop, because we see a lot of bat poop.
Oh my gosh. So, one of our next questions was, what kind of living creatures do you find? And I guess in this case, other than bats, because if there's bat poop there, there's bats there. So what else are you seeing in terms of
Yes.
living creatures you don't want to touch?
Usually, they're small, like bugs. They're not going to be like bears or anything huge. I have been to a cave where there was a skeleton from some animals who had gone into the cave. Sometimes we see mice bones, also mouse bones, from animals that did live there, but usually we see only living bugs or insects. The scariest one I've ever seen is called a tailless whip scorpion. Sometimes you see them because people will put them on their face or hold them, and they're big bugs with long legs and big bodies like this big. So I really try to avoid those. I almost put my hand on one once. I was climbing up some rocks and I put my hand on a ledge, and then I peeked my head over and there was a tailless whip scorpion right there. And I was like, oh, I screamed. It was a hole. I was very nervous. I was very surprised. But yeah, I avoid those usually. I'm not somebody who likes to be really dirty or to play with bugs. That's not kind of my scene. So I try to make sure that I don't touch those.
I'm with you there. We might have some future insect enthusiasts here, and that's awesome for them. And maybe they can go into caves and study these special scorpions. But
Exactly.
yeah, so you're saying the geologists and people like you and me, we don't need to touch them. We can leave them be, let them live their happy lives
For
without
others to
us.
do their studies.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Got it. That is really that is really good to know. Let's say you're in the cave and you've identified with the other scientists there with you that that's the one, that's the stalagmite we need to study. Now that you've done it, tell us, how do you collect it and how do you bring it back to the lab?
Yeah, we collect it using a sharp chisel and a large mallet or hammer. If I still had mine, I would show it to you, but they all stayed in my lab at MIT, so I don't have my rock hammer anymore. But it's a slow process sometimes. So sometimes it can take an hour or more to sample the rock. Sometimes it's already broken. Usually we try to find ones that are already broken or partially cracked so that they're ones that might fall in the future anyway. And we take the chisel and we hit it like this, like ding, 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 and try not to hit any of the other formations around it. So that's part of why it takes so long, because we don't just whack it as hard as we can. But we sort of slowly try to tap around it to loosen it. And then we usually just pack it up with duct tape. I wrap my clothes around it to keep it safe. Whatever we can do really in the field to make sure that it stays safe and does not get broken, because we want it to be our sample. We don't want it to be falling into pieces. So I've had a friend once carry a pretty big sample, basically like this, and everybody else carried his backpack and his other stuff, and then we had to very carefully move it out. But usually they are in pieces, not big hefty stalagmites like that. Yeah, we don't usually take those. The one that we found was already fallen and had been marked for research, so that's why we ended up taking the big one.
Got it. Okay, that is super good to know. So these future scientists will follow in your footsteps and collect them carefully as you do.
Yes. Yes.
And now we have a couple of closing questions as we reach the end of this totally awesome MIT abstract. First, Yahia Walid is wondering, how does your disability affect your work as a scientist? And you're going into these caves or standing for long hours in the lab analyzing samples. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it's something that I've had to learn over time, because I didn't know that I had a disability when I was younger. So I didn't know until I was in grad school that this was something that I would deal with. And so, like you said, Fatima, standing for long hours in lab, that's something that I can't do. So I actually pull a chair up to my lab station and I sit when most of the other people in my lab stand, but I sit because I just get way too tired and all of my joints hurt too much to do that. So I wouldn't be as good at my job if I were standing. So I do things a little bit differently in that way. In the caves, I work really hard with my team to make sure that they're aware of what I can and can't do, and prepare a lot. So I don't do very well in hot temperatures. So I train for going into the cave and going to do field work by going into like a hot sauna or putting myself into really hot temperatures so that I can increase my tolerance for field work. I wear a lot of different braces for my joints, or athletic tape. I basically tape myself together, and take other steps like that that help me be more effective. And I try to do jobs usually that are seated or that give me a chance to rest. So for example, you saw me doing a titration in the lab and I was sort of like crouched down. I'm not necessarily going to be the one like scouting for other speleothems in the far ends of the cave. I just sit. Sometimes when I'm really tired, people will bring me the water samples and I'll do all my sampling in one spot, as opposed to going all around the cave if I can avoid it. So small things like that that just help me save energy, and try to decrease the stress on my joints. So I sometimes say it's sort of like an older grandparent. If you have a grandparent who, needs to rest more, can't walk as far, or needs a seat on a hot day, I'm sort of like that. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with asking for what I need, but that's sort of how I explain it to people.
Got it. And we have time for just a couple more questions. And I think this one I want to know the answer to too. Shurya and Jetty is asking, what is the name of the book that you're working on, and how quickly can we get our hands on it?
Thank you. Yeah, it's called Uncharted because it's sort of an idea that there aren't a lot of books about scientists with disabilities by us. And so it's uncharted territory, if you will. So it's called Uncharted and it is not yet published. It will probably be published either next year or the year after. It's due to the publisher in January. So I'm working a lot right now on trying to get it done. I will get it done as fast as I can for all the students who want to read it. But it's not yet out and it will be coming out in the next year or two. Pretty slow process.
Well, will you sign my copy?
Of course, I would love to. Will you sign my copy of your papers and thesis book?
Yes, I'll sign my thesis for you for sure.
Excellent. Okay.
And now for our concluding question for Gabi. And by the way, I have to say we've gotten over 100 spectacular questions, and I'm just so sad we don't have time to answer all of them. I wish we could, do this forever. But
yeah, me too. We can do all day questions.
Yeah. Let's end with a good question that's thinking forward. So for the students who you have inspired in this call and they're looking at you and they say, wow, I want to do just what Gabi does. I want to be a scientist and I want to help people get their educations and, get the research experience they need and just, help everyone become a scientist. Gabi, what would you advise to them? What advice would you give these kids?
I would say that you need to read and write a lot as a scientist. And so even if you don't necessarily think that that's part of science, it's a super important part of it because we have to read previous papers, we have to write our own research. And so do your best to try to learn in all different subjects so that you can apply them all to your science going forward. I don't think anybody should do just one thing. I think it should be a wider education. So make sure that you are observing what's around you, read about it, write it down, and that will help you to be a scientist in the future.
Got it. That sounds pretty good. So follow Gabi's advice, everyone, so that we can all be in the lab together and in the field and help each other learn in the future. So Gabi, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise and your story with us. This was totally awesome. And you've undoubtedly inspired a new generation of people who are going to work in science and work about climate. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and thank you all for your questions.
Course. And, thankfully, if you really loved talking to Gabi today and asking her all your questions, we're going to have another abstract next month with Martin Nisser, and he's going to tell us how to make robots with other robots. That sounds totally nuts to me. I already have a billion questions I want to ask. So be sure to tune in and let us know what your burning questions are about robots. And now, once again, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Nord Anglia students and teachers for asking such superb questions to Gabi. Thank you to the MIT Nord Anglia Education Collaboration for making this series a possibility in the first place. And then lastly, thank you again to our phenomenal expert, Gabi, for sharing all your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Bye. Have a good one. See you next time.